stage in our exciting adventure through the wonderful world of Wesleyan theology. We have reached Unit 7. Hopefully you're getting a sense of Wesleyan theology in its core themes and expressions and some personalities, and in the midst of this started to see how some threads come together in unifying the movement. In this discussion, I'm going to talk about the Wesleyan doctrine of the church, Ecclesiology as it's formally called, as well as talk about the founders of the Wesleyan Methodists and the Free Methodists, two of the early holiness churches that split off from the Methodist Church in the mid-1800s. Among the topics we're covering, there's, as I said, a clear Wesleyan theology among different denominations that reflect their shared roots. We can talk about different expressions and different issues, and we'll get a little bit of that. But really, there's an understanding of sanctification. There's a shared conversation. And even in this class, as we've had people talk from different perspectives, whether it's the Methodist or the Nazarenes or the Wesleyans or the AME and a few others, and few from outside the tradition, there's a shared perspective there. But probably of all the topics we're going to cover in this class, it's least true about the topic of ecclesiology, as there's really a wide variety of expression of church life and practice that have developed and continue to develop. From church government to doctrine of the sacraments to style of worship, Wesleyan tradition churches seem to run the whole gamut of ecclesial views on almost any expressive topic. You have some churches that are very fundamentalist in orientation, and some churches that are very missional, and you have some that have very, very traditional approaches to Christian worship, still with the classic hymns, and some who have setups that are vaguely recognizable as church. And yet, among those, there's still that shared conversation. So what's going on? Like with other topics, it might be useful to orient around Wesley's views, and I've tried to do that through the course of these lectures. I know the texts bring in different approaches and understanding. My hope was to at least provide a center of discussion rather than to spend a lot of time trying to explore all the various expressions. So I've tried to hone the center, and a good way of doing that is to come back to Wesley. I haven't limited it to Wesley, but because that's still a shared resource among the many churches, it's an orienting priority. But even Wesley's views were subject to adaptation over the course of his life. He certainly had an ideal in mind, and he was really a high churchman, as they call it, someone who was passionately dedicated not only to the Church of England, but to its forms and function. But he even himself adjusted in light of the contextual challenges that occurred both in the church and also in the experience of the Methodists that he was leading. He was a high church Anglican priest, like I said. He became famous for field preaching across parish boundaries. He was committed to unity with the Church of England. But he was willing to commission Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury as superintendents in America, giving them the power to ordain ministers. Where did Wesley get that power? Not from the Church of England. He got it from what he saw as his mission. So rather than spend an immense amount of time sighing in relief, surveying the different denominations, here are some shared themes that seem to drive Wesleyan ecclesiology from the beginning. And as I do this, I'm admitting I'm not spending a lot of time focused in on the theological elements themselves. The texts are doing that. In previous weeks I've done that, but those have also been lengthier lectures that have, I think, have been needing more development because they're not as familiar. Almost everyone in this class is familiar with your own church experiences, and as many of you are even ordained and or working in churches or closely related to them, you know the polity of your church. So you understand what those are, and the readings will give some differently, and maybe in your posts you can share what some distinctives are. But here, rather than give you all the details and variety and differences and parse those out, in coming to terms with this and the different ways these are expressed, here are some shared themes that helped me see what's really driving Wesleyan ecclesiology from the beginning. What is the core thing that we can still say this is Wesleyan, even though we have different expressions? Wesleyan ecclesiology tends to be revival oriented. Now, certainly that's not all Wesleyan-related churches in existence now, but almost every denomination, if not every Wesleyan denomination, began with a sense of revival. The Methodists did. Go down the list. There's always this tendency, there's this interest in this revival, bringing people to Christ, very evangelical in its traditional sense. And as part of that, it's also renewal emphasizing. So Wesleyan ecclesiology tends to want to evangelize, but once it gets people in, it doesn't stop there. It says we need to renew the churches that were already apart and be renewed in our own lives. It's mission driven. I think maybe this might be the core one. Wesleyan ecclesiology is oriented towards the mission of God as they see it in their context, whether that's revival, whether that's missions, or whether that's a renewal within their context. The emphasis is on what can we do to drive the mission forward. And whereas there might be priorities and opinions and desires about certain issues, there's often this willing to adapt for the mission and let go aside our preferences. Now, that's not absolute, but so I'm talking about the tendencies, shared tendencies in Wesleyan ecclesiology, formation focused. Wesleyan ecclesiology is always interested around the topic of how can we develop people into fully formed Christians. And even if not all churches express that, that's still a core value that underlies the structures. Contextually adaptive. Wesleyan ecclesiology has tended to adapt to settings in a more flexible way than other traditions. And in doing that, reaching out into broader work of the church. And if we include the Pentecostal tradition as sort of the a contemporary expression of this, we see this even more clearly. The Wesleyan ecclesiology draws from a deep well, but applies it with flexibility. And in light of that, we can also say Wesleyan ecclesiology is tradition-minded, but not tradition-tied. So there's a strong interest and a strong focus, and this is Wesley himself, drew from the church fathers, but didn't just repeat what they said. He adapted the language of the church fathers, the Eastern Orthodoxy, and all these different influences in a way that fit his context and reached into the hearts and minds of those he was ministering to. So if we can see these as core elements of a Wesleyan ecclesiology, then we can see how the different denominations can have different particular expressions while still committed within the same overall tradition. In fact, because they're driving from different contexts and concerns, we can even say that these are necessarily part of having different denominations. Now, the ideal would be to have flexibility within a bigger umbrella, but that's the ideal for the church in general, right? So what do you think about those elements? Those are really just ways that I was trying to figure out what is the common bond, rather than to say at the beginning of the lecture, there's nothing in common. There is no Wesleyan ecclesiology we can think of. I think these, for me, really orient a Wesleyan ecclesiology that can, as both an encouragement and critique of churches, offer a shared starting place in theology. We also have in Wesleyan ecclesiology what are called Wesleyan connections. And this is an interesting way of encouraging a kind of unity across denominational boundaries. So there's not as deep a split between the Wesleyan denominations as there might be among other groups who make stronger stands theologically. Even to this day, there's a sense of having a unity. Now, the earliest use of the term connections was really their term for denominations. It was a way of talking about, because they didn't see denominations as a church. It was a collection of local churches, so hence the term connections. But even still, it can be used. So we have the Wesleyan Holiness Connection. We have the Global Wesleyan Alliance. These are different ways of bringing together different groups of people. The Wesleyan Holiness Connection is really the most, if not all, the Wesleyan traditions have a shared discussions and unity. So it's an ecumenical within the Wesleyan Methodist tradition. So across Holiest, Methodist, AME, and others. The links are there. You can't click it on the video, but the PDF, they're linkable. So that's some shared themes. Now here's some debates and divisions that have caused some issues over the centuries. One main one is the Episcopal versus congregational debate. The earliest Methodist churches had a hierarchical structure that included bishops. It reflected the Church of England model. Of course, Wesley was not in favor of this term for his own leaders because he didn't see separation of the Methodist Church from the Church of England as something to be desired. But the early American leaders adopted the language because of the issues they had with the Church of England's hierarchy going back to England. There was a split in the countries, and suddenly now the Church of England was not the church in America, and the Methodists in America had to have some kind of organizational structure. So while Wesley encouraged the term superintendent, even within his lifetime before he died, they took the term bishop because that reflected the Episcopal structure that they were used to, and it reflected for them a sense of being fully the church. So the AME and others who were early expressions of Methodism likewise are still Episcopal. So-called holiness churches. I say so-called because, the title seems to limit, are the other churches unholy? No, but there are certain, those termed holy, and there's some in the holiness churches who aren't very holy. But that's the title we give, so it's capitalized. The holiness churches tend to be more congregational, and that was a way of showing how they were struggling with the corrupt leadership that ended up causing their leaving. The congregational approach emphasizes local church governance with a denominational oversight. Orange Scott, for instance, began the Wesleyan Methodist Church with the goal of being, quote, free from episcopacy and slavery. They saw the hierarchy as part of the problem of bringing reform, and those in power in the hierarchy were active in silencing the kinds of reform that Orange Scott and others were leading to, especially on the topic of slavery. So they wanted a denomination that gave space for freedom and that didn't allow a small subset of people to define the denomination as a whole. When Wesley was in charge, unlike with anything, the leadership, the founder has a vision and participation that is, if not entirely pure, at least is oriented towards a holy purpose, whereas later followers, especially when churches or organizations become part of the establishment, their goals change. And yet, if the structure affirms their office as power, the goals then become the expression of the church itself. And now that's not to dismiss the Episcopal governing altogether. There's certainly good reasons for it, but that's the historic reason for why there's been resistance to it. More debates and division. Worship. I'm saving the worship discussions for more detail for the readings, but it's suffice it to say that worship has been a shared discussion, especially since Charles Wesley contributed so many wonderful hymns to the church. But there's also been a lot of debates and problems about it. Methodists and others in the tradition have long wrestled with holding on to clear patterns of tradition. So the holding on to tradition will not always with the tension of having some adaptation. So there was wanting to hold on to tradition while at the same time seeking connection within a context, and likewise appealing to those in lower classes or those in struggling circumstances. And doing that necessitated a more popular approach to worship to meet people where they're at was a common theme throughout the Methodist movement. We'll talk about the Salvation Army and the William and Catherine Booth. That was one of their core missions, was to reach those with the kind of language and mission that make connection. So early splits in British Methodism occurred over debates about music, such as the Leeds organ dispute, which overflowed into debates about governance and the denomination. The Leeds organ dispute, that sounds like this grand thing, it was a debate over the denomination, you can call it, installed an organ in the Methodist Church in Leeds, and those there were protesting it. So they ended up splitting off from the Methodist Church over the fact that they did not feel that the church was a place for such radical expressions of musical liberalness. But really it was about who gets to say what happens. Who's in charge? These issues are often related to local control versus central authority. Who gets to tell me what the Spirit is doing or how we as a community are worshiping? What does it mean to be a community? Is that a top-down definition, or is that expressed through those who are gathered? So the tensions were governance and worship. They tended to be associated with specific events or grievances, both theological and practical. However, these were not isolated experiences, but almost often were final straws of a rising tension that eventually led to splits. High liturgy is difficult among illiterate populations, and that has been a tension in the Methodist Church, and not impossible. But it's difficult, and those with power tend to like things the way they are. So depending on how that mission is being expressed and those who are in it, there's often a tension between how are we reaching out to the people around us versus how are we continuing to form and provide a worship setting for those who are with us. And that's a tension that still exists in churches today. So it's nothing new. It's not a particularly Wesleyan problem, right? Wesleyan ecclesiology and the way they divide it comes more clear in the American situation. In America, Methodist movements have tended to separate over social issues rather than theological doctrines, as we see more in other Protestant groups in Europe and in the United States, where the tendency is to separate over doctrine of election, for instance, to use one random example, or the end times, or so many other things. But the Methodist movements in America have primarily stayed agreed on theological issues while separating over how this was applied in practice. Examples like the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, who separated over how Richard Allen and the Free Blacks and others were being treated in the Methodist Church. And they said this is not how the Methodists are to treat people in separate ways. And so they said we're going to form our own church. The Wesleyan Methodists, who we'll talk about in a little bit, the Free Methodists, all these, they split over issues directly related to slavery and racism. They claimed that the Methodists were not living out their mandate. They were co-opted by society, and thus to be true Methodists, they had to separate from the structure of the church. Nazarenes, who formed a little later, part of the Holiness Church, formed in part with an eye toward holiness with a passion for working with the homeless, so that to see how this was a socially engaged holiness. Phineas Bresee wanted a holistic ministry that worked among the urban poor and drew them into community, not a paternalistic service at them, but a let's gather them in, let's minister to their whole families, let's participate together in, with, and among these populations. Another big issue in Wesleyan theology has been the definition of holiness. What is holiness? What makes a person holy? What is the process and expression? And whereas you don't see as many sharp divisions in denominations, you certainly see some divisions among churches. And we're seeing this even in our era, where the traditional view of holiness in, say, the Nazarenes tended to be more morality-based and legalistic. These are the things you shouldn't do. Whereas in contemporary era, holiness is being seen more as proactive, and there's a shift to that. But you have these ways and tensions of these different people defining it, trying to come together in a shared community space and not really understanding each other's motives or each other's definitions, and causing tensions in that. But we shouldn't just talk about the dividing. There's also a unifying impulse among the Wesleyan traditions. Even though there have been divisions, there's also been this continued interest in merging together over the decades as they say, oh, we have some common ground. Let's come together. And indeed, as we'll see, that some of those who separated from over the issue of slavery from Methodism came back after the Civil War because they felt, well, that issue had been addressed. Most Wesleyan-related denominations in our era are a conglomeration of multiple groups. Not all these groups are from themselves a Wesleyan background, though a lot are. For instance, the United Methodist Church formed from a merger of the Evangelical United Brethren Church and the Methodist Church in 1968. The Church of the Nazarene is comprised of the namesake denomination founded by Phineas Bresee in Los Angeles, who combined with the Association of Pentecostal Churches. Now, the term Pentecostal was used by holiness churches prior to the Pentecostal movement's launch of holiness. So we're not saying these are what we now consider Pentecostal. These holiness churches used the term and then dropped the term once our understanding of Pentecostals took it up, because they didn't want to be associated with speaking in tongues. And the Holiness Church of Christ, among others. 7 denominations in total came together to form the Church of the Nazarene. The Wesleyan Church was a merging of the Wesleyan Methodists with the Pilgrim Holiness Church in 1968. And the Pilgrim Holiness Church itself was a product of multiple mergers in the previous half century, including about 5 in the 1920s. If you know that Oswald Chambers, the famous devotional and writer, he was a Pilgrim Holiness pastor, if I'm not mistaken. And again, these are not necessarily all from, especially the Church of the Nazarene, they're all from distinctly Wesleyan traditions, but you have them forming into these Wesleyan-derived groups, and thus there's a blending of theology and understanding. So you have the classical Wesleyans who draw more from Wesley. Then you have later holiness that draws more from the revivalistic and the holiness movements of the 19th century, coming together with a shared goal of holiness, though approaching it from different directions. Thus you have diversity even within these denominations about how we actually define these issues, and which still continues to this day. A quick look at Wesleyan sacraments. I'm leaving the broader discussion of this for the readings. In terms of sacraments, the early Methodist Episcopal Church followed the Church of England's approach, and this is reflected in the AME and United Methodist liturgies to this day, and which have a high view of the Eucharist as a means of grace and do conduct infant baptisms. If I'm mistaken about that, by all means, let me know, because this is where you all have more experience in these churches than I do. Certainly have contact and relate in other ways, but I'm eager to hear your understanding of all the topics we're talking about. You all are coming from actual working in churches, so on the ground testimony is very helpful, which is why I'm not trying to say too much here, and also because there's a lot of diversity now. The holiness tradition churches tend to reflect their blended influences and revivalist tendencies. So moving away from the earliest Methodist Episcopal and those who still hold on to this tradition. So baptism is allowed for infants, but it's not required in many holiness tradition churches. So there's this tradition of both of infant baptism and believers' baptism, often in the same congregation. You have a choice, which is a very interesting thing to experience. So my experience, and this is coming from my own connection with these churches, my experience is that Nazarenes have tended to be more open to the former, so they're more open to infant baptisms. Parents can choose to have their children dedicated or baptized, usually sprinkled in a church service. But there's also baptistries for adult baptism as well. And the long-standing Nazarenes, the ones who come from Nazarene families, are the ones I've noticed will often have their babies baptized. Again, that's talking from my particular experience. Wesleyans of the Wesleyan Church tend to officially allow but not encourage infant baptisms. That is, in the discipline, the official constitution of the Wesleyan Church, it is open to it, but I've heard pastors say that they are personally against infant baptism, and I've not seen infant baptism in the Wesleyan churches I've been part. Again, these could be regional differences, as happens, so these reflect my experiences in California. That is an interesting tendency. Personal note, I was baptized while part of a Wesleyan church in a believer's type baptism in a swimming pool when I was about 5 in San Dimas, California. So it was a believer's baptism, full immersion, but I was pretty young, so I think it's kind of a blended feel. But it was a confession of faith. Because Wesley did not allow Eucharist in his Methodist churches, he insisted people attend the Church of England congregation weekly, but he did institute regular what he called love feasts, which was a meal fellowship oriented around worship and exhortation. The early church called their Eucharistic gatherings love feasts. It was limited to committed members. So there was it has a sacramental Eucharistic element, and he was very aware of this, but it did not serve the formal sacraments in the way that he knew that only the Church of England could do. Now, of course, later on, with the part of initiating the American Methodist Church and ordaining as bishops Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, or superintendents, which Wesley did. They used the term bishop a little later. That then gave them authority to do baptisms and Eucharists in the American experience in a way that others didn't.